Okay, well, this is stuff I've been kicking around in my study for a very long time, best part of 50 years, and it's high time I did something with it. So it's been good to take this on, although it's been a bigger job than I expected when I volunteered it, haha. um, what I've been able to do is to put together a lot of the stuff about early ringing in the county, and we're really talking about up to about 1870. So none of the stuff about the Guild, the Midland Counties Association, is in this. It's really looking at what was going on before. And there's quite a lot of evidence really, though not perhaps terribly conclusive. As ringers, we often speak of change ringing as a form of ringing dating back several centuries and think of ourselves as continuing that tradition. We are, of course, but do you ever stop and think about when change ringing first started in your tower, when ringing first originated? I think it probably revolves around when did ringers start going out and mixing with ringers in other towers and being interested in what other people were doing, rather than just pulling the ropes in their own parish churches. And if you think about it, you just wonder when that started to happen, and when ringing as we know it, the community of ringing, that network that we all love and share, became what ringing was about. And when people really started to feel that being a ringer was part of their identity. So this is work that I did back in 1972 to 4, really, when I was a student in Leicester, and in my year after that, when I worked at the Leicestershire Record Office as a trainee. Of course, I'm not the first, or I hope the last, historian of Leicestershire ringing. Indeed, I'm not sure I should really claim to be a historian of Leicestershire ringing at all. It's just an aside, if you like. But of course, if we think about who the historians of Leicestershire ringing have been, we have to remember Ernest Morris, ringer at St Margaret's, Leicester, first man to ring 2,000 peals, rang peals at nearly every Leicestershire tower. Didn't get Shaw, Skeffington, Church Langton, from what I remember, all of which have been pealed in more recent times. And I'd also think it's worth bracketing with William Wilson, because Wilson had made transcripts of all the Leicester ringing books, proved all the compositions in them, and obviously knew a lot about the history of ringing in Leicestershire. And those books are still with his descendants, who, as you know, are still a ringing family. Wilson's daughter was in the First Lady's peal. He's got ringing descendants now. He rang in the Great Peal at Loughborough, the 18,000, the first time they rang around the clock in 1909. And he worked for Samuel Bunning, the donor of St John's bells, in 1902. And he gave the trebles at St John's in Bunning's memory in 1928. And Kingsley wrote a nice little article about him in the Ringing World a couple of years ago. So they are the sort of historians of Leicestershire ringing that we perhaps think of. Now, my connection is really twofold. First of all, I was asked in 1972 by Cyril Ratton, pictured in the middle, if I would go looking through some of the newspapers in Leicester Public Library, because he was just starting work on a compilation of old newspaper reports to learn much more about the history of ringing. Cyril was a lovely chap, very good ringer, and I was really pleased to be asked to do that. And so I spent quite a few evenings down in the City Library, started research, digging in newspapers, and what fascinating stuff it is. Cyril never finished the work in his lifetime, but John Eisel has produced the book since, and a huge collection of old newspaper reports of ringing now is available in the Order and Disorder in the 18th Century publication, and the 4 subsequent volumes that have come out. And in there's a load of stuff about the history of ringing that we didn't really know before. Certainly poor old Ernest Morris didn't. It's stuff that's come to light since his day for the most part. Though I have to say, Ernest did actually go through all the Leicester papers himself, and I know that he knew a great deal about Leicestershire ringing from those newspapers. Now, I still have a card index that I did at the time of, I can't read it now myself either, of information on Leicester and Leicestershire ringing. And I've got a name index as well, so I can look up all the people individually and tell you, which peals Thomas Simpson rang in, which ones he called, and so on. Just before I left Leicester, I did an article for the Leicestershire Historian in 1974, one of my first published articles. And since then, I've done 1 or 2 little pieces on Leicestershire ringing for the Ringing World. But that really is the limit of my interest, and I haven't done a great deal since. Although, of course, because this newspaper stuff is now so much more accessible again, I've been able to top up those researches for this talk. Subsequent to my time in Leicester, I did catalogue Ernest Morris's papers and arranged for them to go to the Leicestershire Record Office out at Wigston, where they now are, along with the older ringing records from the Leicester scholars. Anyway, the history of ringing in Leicestershire is definitely a baton I need to hand over to somebody else. If anyone's really interested in taking this on, I'll gladly share material with them. Now, I'm not going to talk tonight about the origins of change ringing itself. That's well known. There's a lot of uncertainty about the real origins of change ringing, but we do know that change ringing was in existence by the early 17th century. Quite when it came to places like rural Leicestershire is another matter altogether, and that's one of the things that I say that interests me. We have a new history of change ringing in the Sanderson series, published in 3 volumes from 1987. And of course, Ernest Morris's book is still a wonderful compendium of historical information about ringing. It's very well put together. The only trouble with Ernest's stuff is he was a bit of a scissors and paste artist, and he wasn't always that discerning about what he trusted and didn't trust. I mean, having handled his manuscripts, I know that he was literally a scissors and paste artist, because his manuscripts are bits of writing, a cutting, bits of writing, a cutting, and it all looks very unified when it's in print. But that's what he was doing. But he did that very well. So I'm not going to talk about that. What I'm going to talk about instead is what was happening in Leicestershire. And if you haven't got bells, you can't have any change ringing. And so we're starting by looking at what bells there were at particular dates. Now, if we go back to 1600, which is, of course, when change ringing was in its very infancy, if it was going at all, there are actually very few rings at all in the county. I think possibly only 9 rings that we count as change ringing peals today. Those 5 rings of 5, 2 rings of 6, possibly St Margaret's, Leicester. I'm not completely sure whether there were 6 that early or a little bit later, 1633. But the evidence seems to be there may have been 6 by the late 16th century. Move forward to 1700, and I've got people on my screen, so I can't see. See my own list. Yeah, there were perhaps about 28 5s in all, so there've been quite a lot of augmentations by that date. The biggest was Melton Mowbray, a thundering great 5 of 2,700 weight or more, and there were some other big ones too. There were at least 6 6s by then: Loughborough, St Martin's, Leicester, the Cathedral, St Margaret's, Market Harborough still, and one at Bottisford up in the north of the county. Perhaps about 34 rings in all, but no 8s yet at all. One of the things that I've felt when I've been going through this was that Leicestershire was perhaps underbelled compared with other counties. Northamptonshire particularly had a lot more 5s and 6s by these sort of dates than Leicestershire did. And Warwickshire had the bells, but there is very, very little evidence of the ringing. Let's just look over the fence at the neighbours for a minute. There were starting to be rings of 8 and even rings of 10 around. The first 10 in the provinces was at All Saints Derby Cathedral, 1678, a very early ring indeed, originally hung 4 over 6 and with a very weird rope circle, but 10 bells hung for ringing. Lichfield Cathedral had a purpose cast 10 in a new frame in 1688 and was the first 10 of that type of installation. St Michael's Coventry, again the cathedral, had an 8 in 1675, replacing a 30 weight 6. Nottingham St Peter's were augmented in 1672, and the trebles were actually given by the Ringing Society, the Northern Youths. Lincoln had an 8 by 1702, and there's a list in the middle there of some of the others in the area. Most of them slightly after 1700, but you've got Solihull as an 8 in 1686, and St Mary's Warwick with a very early 8, 1656. They lopped off a big tenor to cast 3 trebles, and then because the whole town was destroyed by fire in 1694, they got a new church, a new tower, and a brand new 10 in 1703. So there was stuff going on out there, and Leicestershire was a little bit behind this general movement. Now, the big question we have to ask is, did Fabian Stedman visit Leicester in 1699? And did, as people have suggested, that laid the foundations for change ringing in the county? Well, as I said, Ernest Morris drew heavily on stuff that he found without necessarily checking its veracity. And the Barrow manuscript is fascinating. It's a late 19th century compilation, probably written by a chap called William Barrow around 1900. And it's in the form of a sort of diary that covers all sorts of aspects of life in Leicester and the surrounding area. Harry Poyner in 2015 wrote about it, and obviously casting doubt as to whether John Eisel's interpretation that it's a late 19th century fiction because certain statements are demonstrably incorrect. Harry bucked back against that and disagreed, but I must say my feeling is that this is a fiction and shouldn't be taken too seriously. It's a very clever fiction, though. Barrow was very good at stringing things together from limited facts, making what looks like a plausible statement from some of these diary entries, like 1616 at Loughborough. Quite a lot of what's in that paragraph is correct, but other bits of it just can't be substantiated and would actually be unlikely when you look at it with what we know about other aspects of history. So I think that we probably have to discount the idea that Stedman visited and some of the other stuff that is in the account that's given here. So leaving Stedman aside, what do we know? Well, before 1700, most Leicestershire churches only had 3 or 4 bells, but they were rung. One of the things that's interesting looking at the old parish accounts is that even in small villages with only 3 or 4 bells, there are ringers. There are ringers who are paid for ringing on those public occasions when bells were rung. Guy Fawkes Night, Oak Apple Day, things like that. There was a lot of local pride in bells, and parishes spent lots of money maintaining and improving those bells. And there was rivalry between parishes for having bigger and better bells. We know all about that from lots of places, where there are verses saying, you know, our bells are better than yours, basically. The other thing is that bells, although in a church, were instruments of the community. I think when you look at the accounts and look at the reasons why people provided bells, they were much more as community instruments than specifically for the church. And of course, there's also this thing that back in those days, ringing, full circle ringing for services, really wasn't a habit. Ringing took place at other times and bells were just chimed for services. So the parish accounts record these payments for ringers and for ringing on public ringing days. But the key question perhaps is, were these ringers just local to their own towns or did they mix with others? We get some glimpses, but not very many. 1616, there is a payment in the accounts, and this is what Barrow drew on for that paragraph I was just pointing out. Spent in giving entertainment to the gentlemen strangers when they came to ring. This is when the bells had just been augmented to 6, and the parish spent 12 shillings on entertaining these ringers who came to have a go on their bells to make sure they're okay. 1629 to 30, you've got parishioners from Leicester Cathedral, St Martin's, going to Lutterworth to view the frame there before they had their own bells rehung. And I suddenly had a conscience about this last one, wondering actually if this was a fiction like Barrow, but looking into it, this document was known as early as 1860, which is long before Barrow's time. And 20 skillful persons from Leicester are supposed to have accompanied Samuel Scattergood, who was actually a past master of the College Youths, to test and try the new bells at Solihull in 1686. So that implies some expertise in ringing, not necessarily change ringing, in Leicester by the late 17th century. I think there's also some evidence that bell founders, especially Hugh Watts of Leicester, who cast bells all across the South Midlands, was encouraging parishes to follow fashion in bells, to have more bells, and probably passing on tips about the way to ring as well. If we look in the accounts for parishes, you find entries like these. Paid to the ringers when King James was proclaimed, and another one for a proclamation of another, King William and Mary. Given to the ringers at the coronation, and very often for the anniversary of the coronation too. That was a regular festival. Paid for ringers for the news of the victory at sea. 5th of November, 29th of May, Oak Apple Day. And another one at the bottom, given the ringers the 19th of July on the news of the Duke of Marlborough's success in Flanders. So these are just some occasions when the ringers were paid, but by no means the only occasions when the bells were rung. What sort of ringing was it? Well, this gets much more difficult because there really isn't much information. We know that change ringing existed, but we don't know for sure how prevalent it was. But this is the sort of thing, the sort of relic that sometimes turns up and tells us something we didn't know before. I found this in a pile of debris in the church at Walsgrave a long time ago. And it's a post with 4 sides, one side for each of the ringers. And you can see from the post itself, there's a slot in the bottom where it can be fixed in the floor in the middle of the ringing room. And on each side, there are a set of numbers. These figures are basically the numbers for a method that we call double Canterbury minimus now. But it was known as the plain changes because it's got the minimum movement of bells among the others. This is dated 1778, but one can imagine it's the sort of ringing that had been practiced for a long time. The stuff that was very popular at the time of Stedman and Duckworth's books in the 1660s and 70s. This post actually, incidentally, shows that the ropes were hung anti-clockwise, and this could have been rung as changes, but more likely to have been rung as called changes, with the conductor saying, change number 1, change number 2, something like that. It would work either way. I don't know of any of these sort of ringing relics in Leicestershire, but it's a long time since I rang at most of the country churches in Leicestershire. If there are any, 19th century or earlier, I'd certainly be interested to know of them because they may help to flesh out a picture of what ringing was like. There are a number of instances of ringers' rules. This is the ringers having a ringer's identity, being regarded as a subset within the parish. You know, these are the ringers. The ringers are subject to these rules. The best example in Leicestershire is at Great Bowden, and Rob Sully kindly photographed it for me, though it's difficult with the light and also with the fading of the board itself to get a very good shot. But the wording is on the left in North's Church Bells of Leicestershire. Very typical stuff. It's all about no drinking, no smoking, no brawling, no profane language, don't wear your hat and spur, and so on. There's another set example in Magna, or was, Ernest Morris gives that example. And they're common all over the country, but there are some particularly attractive ones down in Cornwall. That one at St. Endelion in Cornwall with the 6 ringers and their bells, and we ring to quit the church, the dead to grave, and so on. But there's a nice little thing in there saying bells are for modest recreation, ringing as a pastime and an activity. You know, they're included in the ringers' rules. Rather nice touch. Now, if we move fast forward to 1876, the number of rings in the county had considerably increased. By that date, on the right, you've got 2 10s, St Margaret's and St Martin's. There had been a 10 briefly at Kings Norton. We'll come back to those later on. There were by then, how many 8s? Lost count. 9 8s, I think. Church Langton, Kings Norton, Hinckley, Melton Mowbray, Ashby, St Mary's, Staunton Harold, Loughborough, and St Mark's. And some of those were of 19th century creation. In fact, 6 of them. And if you look on the left, you can see that the numbers of rings had gradually grown, with the increments on the right with the plus signs on the top table, show the 25 new rings created between 1600 and 1700, 15 in the first and 15 in the second half of the 18th century, and then 17 in the first 3 quarters of the 19th century. And by then we'd start to get quite a large number of 6s, 21 6s by 1876. So there's the kit now for ringers to ring on. That's the point I wanted to make. The heaviest ring in the county, of course, was at St Margaret's. Tenor actually weighed about 2,900 weight when it was taken out for recasting. And Leicester City had the highest concentration of rings, and also that was the main centre of ringing. If we look at change ringing at the opening of the 18th century, then we got the appearance of the first of the ringing textbooks. That's Duckworth's book on the right, 1668, but published by Fabian Stedman in London. There's the Campanologia, came out, Stedman's own book, and just as the 18th century turned, the first of the Campanologia Improved came out. And these books were lapped up by ringers everywhere. If ever you find a copy, it's always very well thumbed, very well used. Let's look at some of these augmentations in detail and see how they came about. Two in the west of the county, Appleby Magna, increased from 4 to 6 by local efforts, 1769 to 74. And the inscriptions tell us about the funding. Some of them were recast at the expense of the parish. One of them was given by Mr. Moore's family. The Moore family were the founders of the Appleby Magna Grammar School, and that gave them a ring of 5. And then the 6 was completed a couple of years later, again by subscription. So this is community support for bell work. The parish were paying by the rates for the main recastings. Donors were coming forward, and then the parishioners were subscribing because they wanted yet more bells. The same's true at Ashby de la Zouche. They were a biggish 5, made 6 by gift of the inhabitants, 1741, and then augmented to 8 in 1814 to commemorate the peace. 2 examples then of community funding. Of course, there are ringer-led improvements. William Barrow there gives us an account of how the augmentation at St Margaret's might have happened. Ringers having a festival, getting together, dining at the Angel Inn, voicing the idea of 2 new 4 bells, and it would enhance the music of the town, facilitate instruction. It's a bit too much like a lottery application to be genuine. If you do documentary research, primary material just does not exist in this form, which is one of the reasons it has to be a fiction, though, as I say, a completely plausible one. So St Margaret's got the first ring of 8 in 1711, and clearly it was to do with benefactors because one of the inscriptions said so, prosperity to all our benefactors. It's also known from the city archives that the Corporation of Leicester gave £20 towards the new bells. So the idea that it was worthwhile for the community was clearly there. And the 2 trebles were cast by the man who is considered the best bell founder of his age, Abraham Ruddle of Gloucester. The Ruddles produced these wonderful catalogues at various intervals from 1705 onwards of the bells they'd cast, and they're itemised down to the bells they cast for individual churches. And you'll see from the 1715 catalogue, Leicester Town, St Margaret's to make 8, 2. So everything in Barrow's account stacks up, but the basic information of what we genuinely know is at the bottom. There are some lovely cases of individual donors as well. Landed gentry coming forward to buy new sets of bells. Sorry, I'm struggling already. Heather says I'm not doing enough talking at the moment. Beckleton's a good example. A 6 cast by Emmanuel Halton in 1714, and a 10 hundredweight 6, total weight 2 tons, replacing 3 bells with a total weight of only 13 hundredweight. And they were given by Thomas Boothby of Tooley Park, a great hunting man, a squire, who was clearly a lover of bells and wanted to have a good set of bells in his local church. Interestingly, the Stony Stanton ringers, in a report of the ringing they did there in 1845, put in this lovely comment: "These bells are intended to imitate a pack of hounds in full cry," which they certainly do in great measure. Wonderful description of the peal of bells, and of course completely fitting for Boothby, who was a Leicestershire huntsman. Swithland is another example. I don't know how many bells there were there before. I imagine there was a ring of 4 or 5. But again, the present bells were given by Sir John Danvers of Swithland in 1760. But Leicestershire has one of the greatest of ringing's benefactors, William Fortree of Norton. His family had been in the area since Doomsday. Fortree himself was born in 1698 and inherited a wealthy estate when his father died in 1722. That's the family tomb of the earlier Fortrees. Fortree left a space on it for his own memorial, but in fact he's not commemorated. It's only his forebears who are on there. Anyway, Fortree spent his money in various improvements to the village. First, he rebuilt Galby Church, 1741, and gave 6 bells cast by Thomas Eyre. And then in the 1760s, early 1760s, he built the fabulous new church at Norton by Galby, King's Norton. The church itself, 1760-61, the spire a little bit later, and of course it fell off again in the 19th century. But he gave a ring of 8 bells, incorporating one with the name of one of his Whaley ancestors on, mostly by Eyre, 1760-64. Eyre also made the clock and the chimes. Fortrey gave the organ, and the bells were later augmented to 10 in 1781. They're Fortrey's principal gifts to ringing, but by no means the only ones. One of his earlier ones was at Kibworth. If you see that picture of Kibworth on the top left, you won't recognise it because Kibworth doesn't have a spire today. It fell in 1825. But Fortrey paid for new bells there in 1732, cast by Thomas Eyre. He gave the 2 trebles to make 10 at St Margaret's in 1738, and at that same time Eyre also recast 3 of the others, including the original 1711 trebles. They were clearly keen to get the best ring they could at St Margaret's, but Fortrey himself gave the trebles. In the middle you'll see the subscription list from John Holt's broadsheet of peal compositions of triples, and at the top of it is William Fortrey, Esquire of Galby, Leicestershire, who bought 4 copies of the broadsheet, which, as I say, has compositions. You can imagine that Fortrey was buying these copies and doling them out to the ringing bands he was supporting, and I'm sure one of them must have ended up down at St Margaret's as a gift from Fortrey. We'll come on later to the competition between Leicester and Nottingham in the 1770s, but Fortrey gave sets of cup handbells, hemispherical handbells, to both the Leicester and the Nottingham ringers in the 1770s. And the Leicester set is in the museum. But when I was in Leicester, we did once have them out for the St Margaret's annual dinner. Strange things they were, but fun to actually have them out and ring on them. And lastly, he gave a treble at Houghton on the Hill in 1771. He died in 1783 at the age of 85, and he was a man of many parts: a mechanic, mathematician, very keen on organs, and he had an ear for music. And his obituary in the Leicester and Nottingham Journal actually says he had a very superior knowledge of the art of chain ringing. What a man! And wouldn't we like some donors like that around today who'd dole out new peals of bells and pay for restorations in the same way? And what a spur for change ringing in 18th century Leicestershire Fortrey must have been. But augmentations were not necessarily always well received. At Church Langton, the village benefited from the efforts of the Reverend William Hanbury. He founded a commercial nursery at Langton and at Gumley and made a lot of money. And he also had music festivals in Church Langton Church for 3 years, 1759 to 61, which again raised a lot of money. And he put this money into the Hanbury charitable foundations, with all sorts of grandiose plans for building a cathedral-sized church in the village, for endowing a school, which happened, for a library, which happened in the school. But one of his schemes was to augment the existing 5 to a ring of 8. And again, that happened in 1762. But unfortunately, he was opposed by Mrs. Pickering and Mrs. Bird, who lived in West Langton, and they were a complete pain in his backside, poor chap. They took him to the ecclesiastical court. They tried to rally parishioners to object to the bells and get them taken out. And it was all about the likely expense of future maintenance. Anyway, the ladies' campaign failed, and when the matter was settled, the ringers rang the ladies out of town when they left. Unfortunately, they'd let it be known that's what they intended to do, and so the ladies crept away before they could actually undergo the ignominy of being rung out of town. Fascinating story, but we tend to think of augmentations as progress. Not always easy, not always straightforward. And that lovely old rectory was built by Hanbury's son, not a few years after Hanbury himself died. Right, so we've got the plant. We've now seen how the bells came into being, the gradual increase of the rings of bells. What evidence is there of change ringing itself? Well, peal ringing, you might say peal ringing is not the be all and end all of ringing. Of course it isn't. But unfortunately, for historians, it's about the only thing that we actually ever get solid, reliable information on, with the names of ringers, what was rung, and so on. So I'm going to look at peals just for what they tell us about where ringing was happening and who was doing it. The first ever recorded 5-bell peal was at East Haddon in Northamptonshire in 1756. Northamptonshire ringing is particularly well documented because the Northampton Mercury is one of the very oldest of the provincial papers, established in 1720. And right from the start, it seems to have been very keen on publishing ringing information, like the Stamford Mercury as well. The Leicester papers started in 1753, and the earlier 20 years or so, the early 10, 15 years, are really pretty thin on ringing information. Later on it picks up. But the Northampton ones are packed full of it, so we know a lot about Northamptonshire, rather less about Leicestershire. But we have a record of a 5-bell peal at Anstey, 5 280 Granta doubles in 3 hours and 10 minutes in 1782. They were a complete ring, cast by Emmanuel Halton, like Peckleton, and that's the first country peal we know of in the county. The following year, there was a peal at Humberston. Humberston were then a 1300 weight 5. The tenor was added in 1876, and the ringers there rang another peal of Granta doubles, 3 hours 16 minutes, and the names of the ringers are recorded in the newspapers. Really nice thing to have. It's rare to get ringers' names. Even at St Martin's and St Margaret's, right up until the 1820s, there are some peals that we've got no more information than that one at Anstey, just a bare newspaper record of the fact a peal was rung. Ringing history is not always easy to get a complete handle on. But somewhere where there is a bit more of a handle is Wymondham. I remember ringing at Wymondham in the days before they were rehung, and John Jelly telling me they were tough. And you can see even in 1843, it was said that ringing the tenor was no small task for the tenor ringer. Well, Wymondham are an early ringer 6. I think. I'm not completely sure the tenor was added or recast in 1755, but I take it was probably recast. Anyway, there's rather nice evidence here for change ringing through the early years of the 19th century. In the floor of the tower, there was, at least Ernest Morris sketched it, this little diamond panel of slate, recording a 720 of Oxford treble Bob Minor, rung in 1810. And on the treble was James Woolman. Woolman, originally from Stamford, where he'd been a ringer, came to Wymondham as a slater and lived there for the best part of 35, 40 years. And he led the band of ringers for 32 of those years. And when in 1846, there was a presentation at the Ringers' Feast in acknowledgement of his years of service. He was clearly the instructor, led a strong band and supported a strong band. And you'll see on the right-hand bottom corner, there's a lovely press report about much praise due to the Wymondham ringers for their regular practice. Scarcely missed ringing twice a week in winter and once a week in summer for the last 35 years. In other words, a strong local band, and they were change ringers. There was a 4,320 rung on the bells at some stage, 6 extents, not a peal, but a substantial length of ringing on such difficult bells. And then in 1843, they did succeed in ringing a peal. Minor of some sort, 5,040 changes, 3 hours, 25 minutes. Woolman died in 1846 on a visit to Stamford to see his family, and naturally the ringers at both places, Stamford and Wymondham, rang a dumb peal in his memory when he died. A lovely little microcosm of an insight to what a local tower was like and what ringing took place. More country change ringing, very few references really where you get actual details of what was rung. But at Syston, where the Syston ringers had been to Loughborough and rung touches of Granta back in 1831, in 1846 there was a band capable of ringing a 720 of Kent Minor. Some of those names crop up later on in this lecture. Hallerton, a 1200 weight 5 by Edward Arnold of St Neots, had a peal rung by a local band of, I think it's 10 methods in 1862. Some strange names, but that was the stuff people used to ring back then. and some of those names were familiar enough when I started, but you don't hear much of Gog Magog and Antelope today. There was a peel there in 1862, and some more ringing, including Stedman and Crambo, two of the more difficult methods. 4 years later, in 1866. Stony Stanton. Who would have thought it that someone who hardly ever goes to Leicestershire, me, would turn up at Stony Stanton for about 2 minutes to take a photograph of the church, and someone called Mick Angrave drove up in his van. Good to see you there, Mick. And I did go and have a look at the statue of the quarryman outside afterwards. Marvellous. Just slightly out of shot, there's a quarryman carved out of a piece of recently felled timber. It's a really nice little village memorial. Anyway, the Stony Stanton ringers in the 19th century became known throughout the area as six-bell specialists. John Orton was the chief promoter of the scheme, and Taylor's produced a complete new ring of 6 in 1842 to replace a ring of 3. Many of the Orton family were ringers, and also Michael Brown's great-grandfather, I think it was. I remember Michael told me that one of the people who rang in this band was one of his ancestors. On George Orton's grave in the churchyard, you can see there's a bell on the top, rather nice. And I think the verses at the bottom might be about ringing as well, but I forgot to read them. I can't quite see them on the photo. The Stony Stanton band were responsible for opening quite a lot of new rings in the region. The Leicester ringers mainly did the openings, but Stony Stanton were so good on 6 that they were sent out to, they were at Leicester St George in 1857, but they also were at Ticknall, Kingsbury, and there are reports of several extensive minor methods rung by them, Peckleton, at Stony Stanton, and at home. John Orton himself also used to go regularly to Coventry to ring. And when he died in 1865, the St Michael's Coventry ringers rang half peal, half muffled in his memory. So a nice little instance of a local band and examples of what they were doing outside their own village. What about beyond peals and 720s? What other information do we get? Well, the openings of new rings of bells or peals of bells that have been rehung can also be informative, even if there aren't necessarily the names of the ringers involved. The earliest instance in Leicester I know of is Hallerton, 1773, when new bells were installed, and the newspaper report tells us they were opened by the ringers of Medbourne, the neighbouring parish, and they rang several peals of changes. Whether that means called changes or change ringing, I don't know, but that's the earliest reference. But from then on, and of course these advertisements in the papers had to be paid for, so that the newspapers weren't sniffy about what news they accepted. There were quite a lot of reports and advertisements for competitions at openings. At Rothley in 1784, the bells were just opened by the Leicester ringers, who went along and rang 5 different peals of 120. In other words, 5 extensive doubles of one sort or another. Great Glen had a competition, but that one doesn't tell us anything about what was to be rung. And in 1792, Bottisford were rehung, the treble recast, and the ringers came down from Nottingham, a select compilogians from Nottingham who rang on that occasion several peals with great exactness and truth. The connoisseurs, that's the newspaper spelling mistake, not mine, in this noble and recreated art went away bestowing greatest iconiums on Mr. Headley, the founder, and on the ringers. Very lovely, florid language of the time. Now, happily, there are 2 competitions quite close together in date. One for a stony competition, round ringing, and one for scientific, as they'd call it down in Devon. The stony competition was at Wineswold in 1795, when the prize for the ringing of a guinea was for the best round peal for the space of 20 minutes. So that's rounds and chord changes maybe. When it came to Havant competition, and this was the second opening they had, George Heatherley rehung the bells and cast a couple in 1791, but they weren't much thought of. Oh, and I meant to say that about Peckleton as well. I'll just say that in a second. But Edward Arnold from Leicester was called in and recast some of them again, and there was a competition. Just to get back to Peckleton, the advertisement that I found that was in the Order and Disorder, sorry, tells us that, in fact, Thomas Clay of Leicester had cast appeal, but Halton was called in almost immediately to recast them because Clay's bells are so bad. I think there's only one bell by Clay left anywhere. He also cast a ring of 8 for Southwell Minster that were recast after 10 years. So he was not perhaps the best founder, with 2 peals that were replaced almost immediately. Sorry, but that's a diversion. At Hathon, the competition was to ring 3 different peals of 120 changes each, and for a prize of a gold-laced hat. You can imagine these ringers turning up with the hats they'd won at different competitions. You know, oh look, they've got the gold-laced hat, they must have won that competition. All part of the identity, all part of being a ringer. Well, the Hathon competition was to lead to an absolutely classic 18th century rivalry between these 2 parishes, Barrow and Sileby. And you'll see here I've put in G and in E because that's relevant to what comes in just a moment. Barrow bells had been rehung in 1788, again by Edward Arnold, and there'd been a competition for 5 good hats for the best 5 bell peals. Sileby were a huge 2300 weight 5, and the Leicestershire historian John Nichols said they're allowed by judges to be an excellent ring of bells and are rung by the inhabitants to astonishment. There's a bit more astonishment about Sileby coming up, but we'll get to that in a moment. The dispute played out in the pages of the local papers between July and later in the year. Both the Barrow and the Sileby ringers had been in the contest at Hathon. They were the only 2 bands present. The ringing was good. They both rang in a very capital manner, and the Sileby ringers won the gold-laced hat. Afterwards, they went to the plough, and the day was spent with the greatest harmony. So, you know, jolly good day out. Ringers having fun, some good ringing, a good nosh, and so on. But after the event, the Barrow ringers decided they was robbed, and so they issued a challenge. We, the change ringers of Barrow, think ourselves not well used, and so on. And they issue a challenge to ring the same bells again, but the tenor was not to be under G. So here we are talking about they want to ring on bells their own weight. For any sum the Sileby ringers may propose, most peals, best peals on 5. The Sileby ringers, of course, reacted. They said, don't blame us, there were judges there and they made the decision. So it's not our fault if you feel ill-used. We think you're ignorant to challenge the whole county to ring you upon bells that are just your own pitch. But they agreed to the challenge, and they're going to ring on both their peals, Sileby and at Barrow, and at Hathon, where they can repeat the thing again. If you will not accept this fair challenge, you will be considered a losing-like set of people. Almost out of Monty Python, that, isn't it? Barrow then took almost a whole page advertisement. Well, not seriously, but there's a lot of words here if they're playing by the word. To the hostile ringers of Sileby, in reply to their scurrilous language, complaining about the ill language and saying they're not at all afraid of ringing with you upon the letters E, F and G. They say they'll meet them at Leicester, one of the 2 10-bell towers, and leave it to the Leicester gentlemen, the change ringers, to decide who won. They reckon that the Sileby ringers have been out boasting and bragging about having taken the prize from Hathon. And also that they say it's unfair. And the reason they want to ring on G bells and E bells is because Sileby ringers had a lot of practice on light bells, but the Barrow ringers had none on heavy bells. Almost seems fair enough. Anyway, they're offering whatever sum they choose to mention. Let the county see we are masters of the art. So that's October. The Sileby, this is the last chapter. Sileby ringers fought back again with another long advertisement in the paper, saying they'd been silly to promise a competition at Leicester when they hadn't asked whether the bells would be available, because of course there was resistance to competition ringing. But they are prepared to meet at St Margaret's. but they're also saying the Sowerby ringers are stupid because you can't get a proper peal of 5 out of middle combinations on a ring of 10, because we suppose your overnice musical ears will not admit to anything which is not so. Anyway, they say the word hostile applies only to yourselves, as you disagree and fight each other about which is the best ringer and who's got the most money. Then there's a verse. So many of these 18th century clashes have verses in. They're always a bit strange, but also a bit funny. This is naught but your strut. You haven't got 50 quid to go for this. You've only got a few halfpence wrapped in a hose foot. Accuses them of giving battle with piss pot and brush. And then say, you know, come on, get sensible, or you'll soon wring all the money out of your pocket. And they say it'll be foolish of us to continue this paper war, as some people term it, as it was in you, the barrow ringers, to start it. Wonderful stuff. Doesn't that just give you a super feel for 18th century ringing? And of course, also the friction between neighbouring parishes. There was no greater enemy than the people from your next village. And here you have it, played out in the belfry. There are 2 Sowerby sequels, and this slide looked really rather nice when I just got that picture of Prestwold Church and the hall and the thing at the bottom. But when I came across the thing on the left, I just couldn't resist putting it in, because it looks as if the Sowerby ringers weren't just good at ringing. The 5 Sowerby ringers between them had an astonishing number of 57 children. Poor women, poor women. Anyway, in 1815, it wasn't the barrow ringers who were chosen to open the new bells at Prestwold, it was the ringers from Sowerby. What other glimpses do we get? Well, written records with names of ringers are rare, but there are some. Just 2 examples here. The name books of the college ewes, founded in 1637, have a complete record of all the members of the society right back to the start. And in the middle of it, in 1732, we've got Gabriel Newton of Leicester. That's Alderman Newton, as in the school. So he was a ringer, but his name doesn't appear in anything because he died before the sort of peal ringing started and names started to appear. And then in 1759, you've got 4 ringers from Leicester, including John Martin. We'll hear a bit more about him in a moment. And 2 from Loughborough, where there's no evidence of change ringing that early, but 2 names from Loughborough, maybe there were change ringers there. Henry Carrick of Leicester appears on both sides of this slide, and Edward Arnold, the bell founder, does too. If we go over to the right, the 18th century books very often had subscription lists in them. They're published by subscription, so you know you signed up in advance, paid your deposit, and you got your name in a list of subscribers. Well, the Clavis Camp and Loggia appeared in 1788, and has at the front a list of subscribers with about 230 names in, and I think they sold about 350 copies. And in that subscription list are these names from Leicestershire, Staffordshire and Nottinghamshire. You've got Henry Carrick and Edward Arnold again. Carrick's name doesn't appear in any ringing, but he's clearly pretty keen if he's a college youth and he's bought Clavis. There's Mr. Percival of Appleby Magna, Mr. Pick and John Wartnaby of Great Dalby, we'll come to in a minute. Joseph Smith of Leicester, he's a name that we know, conducted several peals. And the societies of change ringers at Burton, Grantham, Leicester, Mansfield, Newark, and so on. So you've got people here who are clearly interested enough in ringing to be doing these things, even if their names don't show up. And Great Dalby was John Wartnaby's and Mr. Pick's tower, and you'll see that Wartnaby's name is on the treble and tenor, which were recast when he was churchwarden. Ring of 5 there, and clearly, you know, he was interested in change ringing. Well, I've deliberately looked at the villages first because in some ways the fact that there's change ringing in Leicester is obvious. What was going on in the countryside is perhaps more elusive and more interesting. These records of peals summarise the main activities in Leicester. You've got 21 peals at St Margaret's between 1730 and 1880, and the first one back in 1730, Granser triples. As you'll see, most of these peals are Granser, and I'll be saying a little bit about the non-Granser ones a little bit later. St Martin's were 6 until 1781, but then they became a 20 hundredweight 8, And there were 12 peals there until 1837, and not another one until 1902. So, but for a while in the 1780s and 1790s, they're very much used, 9 peals in just over 10 years. Again, mostly Granser, but the more adventurous ringing took place here. There were also 9 peals at St Mary de Castro that I'll come to in a short while. Now, if you look at this, you get the names of the leaders of ringing as well. William Bull, who later moved to Shrewsbury and was quite a leading light in ringing in Shrewsbury in the 1780s and 90s. Thomas Simpson, really active from the 1790s through to his death in 1831. He died in Trinity Almshouses near St Mary de Castro, a part of a rather tragic story I'll tell in a moment. Edward Biggs was the leader for much of the 19th century, and just at the bottom you've got Jack Buttery calling the first of his peals that he called. John Martin again we'll come to, and Joseph Smith we'll see again too. I'm just going to take a few of these and give you some instances of what was going on. Leicester versus Kettering. Sounds like a football match, doesn't it? 1729 to 31. For those of you who don't know, the strange date 1729-30 means that because until 1752, the year started on the 25th of March, Lady Day, and so the first half of until they changed the calendar, and therefore you have to be a bit careful about dates in January, February, and March until after the change of the calendar. Sometimes people convert them to the modern year, but that's confusing because you don't actually know which year you're talking about. If you put the split dates in, 29-30, you know that it was called 1729 at the time, but by modern reckoning, it's 1730. You confused? Yes. Well, not surprised. It's easy to get confused. Well, here we have a classic rivalry again. The language is also good. I'm not going to go through the quotes in the same way, but if you want to see them, there's Cyril Ratton's excellent article, Case of Peas and Beans, because that's the closing line of one of the verses, in the Ringing World 1985. Now, Kettering, the first peal, you'll remember, was rung at Norwich in 1715. And you may think, well, you know, this is really quite interesting, this activity going on in Leicester and Kettering, you know, barely 15 years later. It is interesting, but actually what's even more interesting is that there was an amazing spread of peal ringing across the country in the 1720s and 30s. Strange places like Oswestry, Ross-on-Wye, Ledbury, all had peals at about that time. But Kettering did get off to a quick start. They'd had a new ring of 8, 1714. Thomas Eyre and George Eyre of Kettering, the bell founders, clockmakers, were members of the band. George Eyre was in both these two peals that are listed there. And Kettering ringers rang a half peal in 1721. Leicester then rang a peal of Granser triples at St Margaret's, then a 30 weight 8, of course, on 23rd of February, 1730 modern style dating. And Kettering rang one just 5 days later. And it all kicked off. The Kettering ringers thought their performance was just as great a performance as the one in Leicester, and they didn't believe that Leicester one could have been rung in so quick a time. It actually published as 3 hours, 6 minutes, 27 seconds, which does seem quite fast for 30 weight 8. So the controversy was all about that, and they started a wager as to, you know, bet you can't beat this, bet you can't beat us. So 12 months later, the Leicester ringers had another go and got their time down to 3 hours, 2 minutes. And the Kettering ringers then had another go and got their time down to 2 hours, 48, insisting in the newspaper reports that at half time it had been exactly half the finished time. So this was a controversy, but it actually got both towers ringing peals. Leicester carried on ringing peals. There wasn't another one at Kettering until 1841. A little incident then that kicks off the start of peal ringing in Leicester. Now, the earliest records are very often just newspaper reports of varying levels of detail. Sometimes just a peal was rung, full stop, almost. Other times you get the names of the ringers. The Northampton Mercury for 1738 gives the names of the ringers, but only 7 of the 8 ringers for the first peal of Granser triples at St Margaret's by the Young Society of Ringers. The first surviving records start in 1773. There are 3 ringers notebooks in all. They've all been overwritten by later generations, so they're quite hard to use and work out, whether stuff was entered at the time or entered later. And what started off as John Martin's book ends up being used by somebody else. But they're fascinating and fantastic. You've got compositions, you've got names, but they're also inaccurate. You can date things from the newspapers, and the dates in the records are clearly not quite right. And the peel board dates sometimes don't correspond either. But the records are there, and Leicester is one of the few places for which there's actually such good records. The next story that's worth covering, I think, is the long peels in 1776 to 7. It's thought that these were encouraged by William Fortree. Fortree offered a challenge to the Leicester and Nottingham ringers to ring a long peel of 10,080 changes. And the press report in Leicester of May 1773 mentioned that they were intending to go for a long peel. No details. It didn't actually happen until 1776, when they rang a 6,012 Gransicators, and that was a composition by W.D. Crofts of Nottingham. Then the following year, February the 25th, 1777, they rang a 10,080 Gransicators at St Margaret's. 1,300 weight 10, and they'd rung 5,000 changes in the morning. And after half an hour's rest, started again and achieved glory. And they beat Nottingham. They got their peel name up on lights on the peel board. But actually, when you look at the peel book, the peel records, the story's even more interesting still, because the John Martin's account of previous attempts, and you'll see he rang the 6th. William Bull called it. They had several times. They used to go for this peel every Monday morning, and because Saint Monday was the day that a lot of the workers had off from their trades. And they completed their desires after several attempts. 4 times they rang over 8,000. Once they rang over 9,000, and then a man that rang the 3rd missed his sally and upset the bell, and so the peel was lost. 9,000 is quite a long time to ring without getting a peel. And then again, on the day, 5,000 changes in the morning, and in the afternoon they rang it, 10,000. They were treated immediately after the peel in the pub by the inhabitants, and the following day there was a victory parade. The newspaper carried a report of the peel, saying how difficult it was and what an achievement. It's been rung before, but so seldom I cannot now recollect another instance of it. After the peel, the ringers were entertained at one of the principal inns, and the next day 3 of the elders of the society were cheered through the streets of the town, attended by the militia band of music. Joy seemed to show itself in every countenance. This is not Leicester beating Nottingham. It's like the local derby. Our boys have beaten them. Nottingham did ring a peel at 10,000, and in fact they got to the 6,000 first, about 12 months before Leicester. And they rang an 8,000 in 1776, but it wasn't until 1778 that they got to their 10,000 and added an extra 180 changes just to turn the knife in a bit. But the other thing about this peel is that the ringers' books contain the subscription list. After the peel, there was a street collection, and this shows you how much money was collected around the town as a benefit for the ringers. And it's arranged by street. You've got Churchgate, you've got Belgrave Gate, and so on. A lovely story, and a very typical 18th century, long peel with all that goes with it. Now, just as in the 1720s, there'd been this huge, arisal of peel ringing, there were actually a load of long peels about the same time up and down the country. A long handbill peel at Abingdon, a long peel at Shoreditch by the Cumberlands, and one in Shrewsbury as well. So Leicester was sort of in the swing of what was going on nationwide, and very much part of something bigger. I said I'd come back to the peels that weren't Granser. In fact, I think there are only 5 peels up until 1870 that weren't Granser triples or caters. There was a peel of Bob Major at St Martin's, lighter bells, 1782. But the most distinctive peel of all in Leicester in these times was Oxford treble Bob, 3 hours 31 minutes at St Martin's in 1786. There was a peal of Bob Royal, there's a peal board for it in the tower at St Margaret's in 1803. And in 1807, there was a peal of Bob Major. And from the time, it must have been on the back eight, and Sibson 3 hours 49, and Thomas Sibson rang the tenor. You'll see there are two people on the tenor for the Bob Royal. That peal was rung all by woolcombers, a trade peal. The other peal out of the box was Kent Major at St Mary de Castro in 1864. Some of those ringers were from Syston. When I mentioned that 1846 extent of Kent Minor there earlier, Charles and Henry Bale were ringers at Syston. And the Wilsons had come from Birmingham and were clearly a bit of an injection of new blood into the rather staid Granser mentality, perhaps, of Leicester. Stedman, there wasn't a local peal of Stedman in Leicester until 1880 at St Mark's, the first of Stedman triples in Leicester, called by Jack Buffery. There was a peal of Stedman caters at St Margaret's in 1853, but that was by the Birmingham St Philip's Society, William Chattell's band, and John Day was the conductor. I forgot to check whether there's a mention of it in John Day's Recollections, but Day's Recollections, recently republished as a book by Richard Jones and David Ingram, is one of the most wonderful insights into ringing, the psyche of ringing, the social history of ringing that you can read, the affairs of the Birmingham band in the 19th century. A lovely read, and John Day was the author of that, and he called that peal. Another characteristic of Leicester ringing was date touches. The first one I know of was at St Martin's in 1781. St Margaret's in 1781. John Martin calling his own composition of Granser Caters. Of course, getting date touches takes a bit of doing. Caters and triples are easier for the odd numbers. So there's only one date touch of Bob Major in that list, 1808. A lot of these are recorded in the ringers' books, many of them with their compositions. The later rings, well, of course, there are 4 19th century rings in Leicester. St Mary de Castro had a big old 5 right the way through, but were remodelled as a ring of 8 with the old 4th as tenor in 1831. There were 9 peals there from 1831 to 1872, mostly Granser, except the one of Kent Trouble Bob. And the first peal was composed by Thomas Sibson, by then living in Trinity Almshouses next door, but it was false. And it broke poor old Sibson, and he died very soon afterwards. I did write an article about that one for the Ringing World, which you can look up. St George's was a new church built in 1827, and it got its ring of 6 bells in 1856, opened by the Leicester ringers and the ringers from Stony Stanton. The Leicester ringers rang a 7/20 minor, and I think the Stony Stanton ringers did too. There was only ever one peal there, 1894, and apparently they were rather difficult to ring. William Wilson arranged and called the peal because he used to ring there. Ernest Morris learnt to ring there, and Jack Buffery used to ring there as well. And the 2 19th century rings just about come into our period. St Mark's 1872, ironically, the very first peal there was also false. And they had to ring another one later in the same year, 1872. 2 other peals before 1880, including the first of Stedman in Leicester. St Saviour's went in 1877, but the first peal wasn't until 1882. And of course, 3 of those rings have gone, along with St John's. Moving towards the last section now, and this is about excursions. The ringers' books, oh, thanks. The ringers' books include details of quite a lot of the excursions. But the first excursion I wanted to mention is Incomers from Nottingham. The Nottingham band rang the opening peal at Uppingham when the new 8 was installed in 1773, and the newspapers tell us they returned home via Kings Norton, Galby and St Margaret's, where they rang. The Leicester Scholars went up to Nottingham and rang a peal of Granser Triples at St Peter's in 1777. And the following year, one of the society went and rang another peal up there with 6 Sherwood youths and 1 of the London College youths. The first big outing the Leicester ringers had was in 1783, when they were invited down to Northampton to open the new peal of bells cast by Mr. Arnold, Edward Arnold, who was then still at St Neots, hadn't moved to Leicester yet, for St Giles. There'd been a big 6, they became 2500 weight 8, and the Leicester ringers went down and opened them one day and rang a peal the next. They had a lovely day, they rang, everyone was impressed with the ringing. After a respectable meeting of the inhabitants of the town, the society dined at Saracen's Head, where the day was spent in the greatest harmony and good humour. Well, if you translate that into the 12 bells version of greatest harmony and good humour, one might be surprised they rang a peal the following day, but they did. Peal of Grancer Triples, conducted by Joseph Smith, with 2 men on the tenor. So that was a big outing. The important thing about it was that the 2 other peals of bells in Northampton, St Peter's in the 1730s and All Saints the previous year in 1782, had been opened by the London College Youths. The College Youths weren't invited back to do St Peter's, they had the Leicester people, sorry, St Giles, they had the St Leicester people instead. Here's an engagement list for the things that we know the Leicester Scholars did. Quite a large number of things they got up to, ranging from peals away from home, invitation peals for openings, opening peals on their own rings of bells in Leicester, St Martin's, St Mark's and St Mary's. New rings of bells in the county, Hinckley, Melton, Mowbray, and some of the smaller places, Shepshed, then a 6, Kibworth, a 6, Thurmaston, Enderby, All Saints the 5, Wigston Magna and Humberston, all places that the Leicester ringers went and performed the opening ringing. Some failed peal attempts at Loughborough, for example, and Ashby, and at Hinckley, failed peal attempts because the bells were going bad. They just rang 500 triples instead, 1260 Grancer triples. And some of these, there's the names of the ringers who went along as well. It went for a day out, not as well as the peal ringers. So there's a lot of history in here as to what was going on in Leicester ringing. But this is almost all taking change ringing out to these places rather than ringing with the locals. I said we'd come back to Kings Norton because it's a place that's always fascinated me anyway. Really lovely church and such an interesting story. The first peal there was rung not by the Leicester ringers but by the Nottingham ringers at the invitation of Fortree, Grancer Triples in 1776. And just as when they went to Uppingham 3 years earlier, they then packed in some ringing on the way home. They went to Church Langton, probably one of the few times at that stage that changes were definitely rung there, and also back via Uppingham to have another ring there. The only record of the 10, really, the trebles were added in 1781, cast by Edward Arnold and taken out at some stage later. Quite when they disappeared is unclear. But this brief record is all that we know about the 10. The Peal of Grancer Caters rung there in 3 hours and 9 minutes for the opening in 1781. The Leicester Scholars went back in 1816 to ring another peal at the invitation of the Norton and Galby Scholars. They had a lovely dinner afterwards, and it's all written up in the book. And also they rang Grancer Caters on handbells before they returned home. Little bits of detail there as to what's going on. Some more openings, 2 of the bigger rings in the county, Hinckley in 1792, Melton Mowbray 10 years later. Hinckley had only had 5 until 1777, made up to 8 in 1792, and the Leicester ringers went down to open them, rang a peal of Grancer Triples on them the next day. The news travelled, and the Aston youths, Aston near Birmingham, were very quick to jump in the following year and go for a peal of Bob Major, and obviously liked the bells because they booked them the following whit for a peal in the newest method expected to surpass every performance of its kind ever done at that place before. Whether they were going to go for a long length, because they were ringing long lengths by that stage, I don't know, but they rang 5088 Grancer Major, which doesn't sound quite as exciting as the puff. So 2 peals there by the Aston band, 1 by the Leicester band. But when the Leicester ringers went back in 1870, they found the 7th was going too badly for a peal. 2 years later, they went back again with quite a few hangers on for a day out, and rang a peal of Grancer Triples with 2 on the tenor. Melton had had a big 5, always reputed 3,500 weight, but probably only 27. Made 6 in 1728, 8 in 1802. The Leicester ringers went to the opening, and along with bands from Grantham and Stamford on the 2nd of December 1802. No peal on that occasion, but in 1807, the Leicester Ringers went back and rang a peal of Grancer triples. No band details, again, just a newspaper report. And another peal of Grancer in 1830, for which the band details are in the books. The next peal was in 1882. Ashby and Staunton Harold go together. Ashby were made up to 6 in 1741, 1815, as we've seen. But in 1810, there's a report of a local band ringing a 720, though the method's unclear, on New Year's Day. And after the trebles had been added, the Leicester band were invited over to ring a peal, which they did on the 26th of April. Leicester band went again in 1851, but the bells going bad, they were only able to ring a couple of shorter touches. But the Ortons from Stony Stanton were among the other people who were there. Again, they took the handbells, and of course, a Grancer Sinks was rung on the handbells. Just up the road at Staunton Harold, there's no sign that the Leicester people were involved at all. Instead, the Burton-on-Trent ringers seem to have had their foot in the door there. And when the bells were made up to 8 in 1831, they were at the opening probably. And certainly in 1832, they went back and rang the first peal on the bells. Ashby bells were rehung again in 1886, obviously in Midland Counties Association time. And a band of ringers trained by John Jagger from Burton. And in 1889, they'd rung a couple of peals on their own bells at Ashby, and went back to ring another one at Staunton. One of the things about ringing I do not understand is how back then a tutor could go out and teach a band of ringers, and they'd ring a peal on their own account without any outside help 2 or 3 years later. Nowadays, it takes 5 years to get people to learn bob doubles. Have we made ringing teaching too complicated, or did those guys know something that we've just forgotten? But there are so many stories of ringers being trained like that, and turning one person turning a band of recruits into a peal band in no time. Last couple of examples: Loughborough and Kibworth. Loughborough was 6 by 1616, recast in 1754. And as we saw earlier, there were a couple of college youths from Loughborough elected in 1759. But when the Leicester scholars rang 720 of Bob Minor there in 1807, they claimed it as the first ever rung on the bells in that tower. Whether that's true or not, who can say? Kibworth, the tower, the spire fell in 1825, and when it was rebuilt, they were restored as a 6, 1208 tenor, and the Leicester ringers went down for the opening and rang a peal of Grancer Minor, 720 of Grancer Minor. Just a couple of examples of the simpler openings. So what you might ask after those last few examples was there no local 8-bell ringing in Leicestershire? We have these 8-bell towers, but not a single reference in the newspapers or anywhere of any change ringing by local bands. Well, at Loughborough, we've got a bit of an example of things coming together, because the new bells there were opened by the Leicester ringers on the 31st of July 1840, but they only rang 504 Grancer triples because the bells were going badly. In consequence, it's supposed of the bells being new and having just been hung. Tailors, of course, cast them and settled in Loughborough as a result. 2 years later, the first peal on the bells was rung by the local band, including J.W. Taylor, John W. Taylor Jr., that is, who died in 1906, one of the bell founders, although his father was running the foundry at the time, and conducted by Christopher Morley. What becomes clear when you read the report at the bottom is that Morley was leaving the area. He'd been the prime mover of getting the bells recast and made up into 8, and he'd also been the tutor of the band, imparting instruction, and gained the esteem of which he is worthy. So after 6 years, he moved on, but he called the peal, got the band going, and of course laid the foundations for a long tradition of change ringing, quite advanced change ringing in Loughborough from that date onwards. Future lies ahead. That's where I'm going to leave the story, with details of ringing as we know it up to 1870. I think, although it's been a bit of a scramble and there's a lot of detail in this, it's perhaps one to come back to and look at the presentation with the pause button in hand. I've actually been able to include almost every reference to change ringing and change ringers that I've been able to find up to 1870. So overall, there's not that much evidence that there was a great deal of change ringing in the county, but no evidence doesn't mean there's nothing happening. What would it be interesting to know is whether any more evidence can be found in the future. We've gained a lot through these newspapers coming on, and I'm just very pleased that the stuff I did in the time I was in Leicester has helped to flesh this out beyond what was known 50 years ago. The future lies ahead in terms of the whole Victorian church restoration movement, belfry reform, getting the drunkards out of the belfry, ho-ho, and getting the ringers regarded as workers of the church, very serious, of course, and the establishment of the ringing guilds, of which you, of course, are today's manifestation. So that is really where we are. I would appeal to you, if you know of any ringing relics, and I say I've not been out and about in Leicestershire towns enough in the last 50 years to have seen any, and probably didn't have my eyes open at the time when I was getting out and about, but peel boards that haven't been discovered, things like ringers jugs, ringers rules, change boards and so on. Any of that stuff actually just could help to flesh out a bit more of the history of ringing. So keep your eyes open and bear it in mind. I hope that what I've given you is an enjoyable overview of what was happening before the Midland Counties Association and the Guild were founded. There was ringing before modern life, certainly, but the evidence of it is not that plentiful. So we have to draw our own conclusions as to what was really going on. So that's all, but thank you for listening, and do replay this presentation if any of this has gone too fast for you. Thank you.